Number 1. Nathan Jerard Dunlap was 19 years old when the killings happened in Aurora, Colorado, in Adams County. He had been working as a cook at a Chuck E. Cheese restaurant, a job that looked ordinary from the outside and placed him around teens and young adults doing typical closing shifts. In the months leading up to the crime, people around him saw a young man who could blend in as just another employee, but court records later showed a more volatile side, lingering anger talk of revenge, and a willingness to drift into crime. According to court findings, the turning point began with work. After a disagreement with a supervisor about staying past his scheduled shift, Dunlap was fired in late July. The humiliation mattered as much as the job loss. Investigators and prosecutors presented testimony that he felt he had been made a fool of and that anger didn't fade. Over the following months, he talked about getting even, and friends later described hearing him discuss robbing the restaurant and killing his former supervisor. So on the day of the attack, while playing basketball, he signaled that he had made up his mind. He planned to go back, kill the employees there, and take the money. On the night of December 14, 1993, Dunlap went to the restaurant shortly before 9 o'clock, carrying a small handgun hidden on him. He ordered a sandwich, sat alone near the front, played an arcade game, spoke with an employee who had finished a shift, and made a phone call to his girlfriend. He also learned the supervisor who fired him was not working that night. Near closing, he slipped into the men's restroom and waited. After the last customers left, and the staff began their end-of-night routine, he came out and opened fire on the workers who were cleaning and closing down the dining area and kitchen. 4 employees were killed. Sylvia Crowell, 19 years old. Ben Grant, 17 years old. Colleen O'Connor, 17 years old. And the night manager Marge Kohlberg, 50 years old. A 5th employee, Bobby Stevens, 19 years old, survived after being shot and then escaping to get help. Witness testimony later described Dunlap's cold, controlled behavior during the attack, including a remark reported after he shot O'Connor. In the back office, he forced Kohlberg to open the safe, then took roughly $1,500, along with small items like tokens and keychains before leaving. The case began breaking quickly. After fleeing, Dunlap went to friends and talked about what he had done while counting the stolen money, even asking for an alibi. He then went to his girlfriend, Tracy Lechman's home, where evidence later suggested he tried to remove traces linking him to the shooting. Police questioned him that night, and he claimed he had left earlier. By the next morning, he was arrested. Lechman was later convicted as an accessory for her role after the crime. A jury convicted Dunlap of 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with attempted murder, robbery, and burglary. On May 17, 1996, he was sentenced to death, plus additional prison time on other counts. Years later, Colorado repealed the death penalty, and Governor Jared Polis commuted Dunlap's sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole, where he remains incarcerated today. Number 2. John Gilbert Graham, often called Jack, was 23 years old when United Airlines Flight 629 was destroyed over northern Colorado. He lived in Denver and had worked as a mechanic, and he was married with 2 very young children. On the outside, he could pass as an ordinary young father. Behind that image, investigators found a pattern of instability, a criminal record tied to forged checks, years of supervision, and frequent conflict in his personal relationships. His deepest conflict centered on his mother, Daisy Eldora King. After his father died, when he was small, Graham spent years in an orphanage. As an adult, He described that separation as betrayal, and people around the family recalled a relationship filled with arguments and emotional distance. Prosecutors argued that resentment and money pressure began feeding into something colder, a plan that treated his mother's upcoming trip as an opportunity. On the evening of November 1st, 1955, King departed from Denver's Stapleton Airport on a flight bound for Portland with continuing service to Seattle. Graham drove her to the airport and said goodbye in a way that looked routine. But investigators later concluded he had placed a bomb inside her checked luggage disguised as a wrapped present. At the terminal, he also bought travel life insurance in her name and made himself the beneficiary, taking advantage of a time when such policies could be purchased immediately at the airport. Flight 629 took off at 6:52 in the evening. Only minutes later, it broke apart near Longmont. Everyone on board died: 5 crew members and 39 passengers, including King, who was 53 years old. The shock spread quickly not just because of the scale, but because it showed how everyday air travel could be exploited by a personal grudge. The investigation became a landmark in careful evidence-driven work. Responders noticed signs pointing to explosives, and the FBI partnered with airline engineers and other agencies to recover wreckage trace luggage and reconstruct what happened. Courts later summarized the central finding: the blast originated in the baggage compartment where King's luggage had been loaded, and laboratory testing identified residues and components consistent with a dynamite device. Witness accounts added pressure to the forensic trail. Graham's wife told agents he had carried a gift-wrapped package downstairs while King packed. A neighbor later recalled that when news spread that a plane had gone down, Graham turned pale and said, "That is it." As contradictions piled up, he confessed, on November 13th. Because federal law at the time did not clearly criminalize destroying an airplane, prosecutors charged Graham in Colorado State Court with the premeditated murder of his mother. His trial began in mid-April of 1956 and ended on May 5th with a first-degree murder conviction and a death sentence. John Gilbert Graham was executed in Colorado's gas chamber at the state penitentiary in Canyon City on January 11, 1957. Number 3. Richard Paul White was 30 years old when police arrested him in Aurora, Colorado, in early September of 2003. He had drifted through ordinary adult roles: co-worker, friend, and boyfriend, and he had lived in a home in Denver's Park Hill neighborhood that at the time seemed like just another rental on a quiet block. To people who didn't know him well, White could appear talkative and familiar, the kind of guy who could slide into a room and pick up a conversation without standing out. Investigators later painted a picture of someone driven by control and impulse, with behavior that escalated over time. What stands out in the record is not one single snapping point, but a pattern: unstable relationships, a willingness to lie when cornered, and a growing confidence that he could hurt someone and get away with it. When detectives began focusing on him for a separate killing, White didn't just defend himself, he claimed he had done far more. That separate case centered on Jason Reichart, a former co-worker and acquaintance. Reichart was killed in Aurora, and White became the prime suspect. After his arrest, police questioned him about that death. During that investigation, according to contemporaneous reporting, White confessed to killing multiple women, describing them as sex workers, and claimed he had buried bodies in different places. In Denver, those claims triggered urgent searches. Authorities discovered the remains of Analitia Maria Gonzalez and another woman buried in the backyard of the Park Hill home White had once lived in. Gonzalez was 27 years old. The other woman was later identified as Victoria Lynn Turpin, who was 32. Autopsy information released publicly at the time confirmed that at least one victim died by strangulation, a method that leaves little noise, little mess, and often reflects a crime rooted in domination rather than panic. The case also included survivors. Prosecutors said 3 women lived through attacks that involved sexual assault and threats with a weapon. Their survival became a crucial part of the case's emotional weight, not only because they could describe what happened, but because they carried the aftermath into court, facing the person who had tried to erase them. By September of 2004, White chose to plead guilty rather than take the case to trial. In exchange, prosecutors did not pursue the death penalty, and White agreed to cooperate as investigators searched for other possible victims he claimed to have killed. On November 29, 2004, a Denver District Court judge sentenced White to 2 consecutive life terms in prison, plus 144 years tied to the murders of Turpin and Gonzalez and the sexual assaults of 3 surviving victims. White also led investigators to human remains near the town of Mesita. In southern Colorado, remains the Denver District Attorney's Office said were believed to be another adult female victim he described from early 2002, though her identity remained unresolved in official announcements at the time. In a separate case for Reichardt's death, White later received a 3rd life sentence without the possibility of parole. Number 4. Gary Gene Tison was in his early 40s when he made his final escape from the Arizona State Prison in Florence. By then, he was known less for any steady occupation than for a long pattern of crime and confinement. He had a wife, Dorothy, and 3 sons, Donald, Ricky, and Raymond, who still visited him. And that family bond became part of what made the next chapter so unsettling. The people closest to him weren't just watching his life from the outside, they were pulled into his plan. Years earlier, Tison's criminal life had already crossed a point of no return. In the late 1960s, after a court hearing tied to a parole problem, authorities said he overpowered the guard escorting him and killed him. Prison guard Jim Steiner. A judge later sentenced Tison to life in prison, and he remained behind bars as the years built up, angry, determined, and still focused on getting out. In the summer of 1978, that determination became a family operation. On a Sunday visit, Tison's sons arrived with weapons hidden in an ice chest, exploiting a relaxed visitation setup. In a matter of moments, guards were held at gunpoint alarms and phones were disabled, and Tison walked out with fellow inmate Randy Greenawalt. The escape didn't feel frantic. It looked prepared, rehearsed, and powered by certainty. The days that followed became a moving crisis across the Southwest. After their getaway car developed trouble near Quartzsite, they targeted a passing family for transportation. The victims were Marine Sergeant John Lyons, his wife Donelda, their toddler son Christopher, and their teenage niece Teresa Tison. Court records later described how the family was taken during the gang's effort to get another vehicle, and all 4 were killed. The fact that the victims were strangers, people who had simply crossed paths with fugitives, made the case feel especially random and frightening to the public. As law enforcement pressure tightened, the group kept moving, crossing state lines and changing vehicles. In Colorado, investigators believe they killed Texas newlyweds, James and Margene Judge, near Pagosa Springs, and stole their van, a crime that Colorado authorities later closed after Arizona convictions in the broader case. The manhunt peaked back in Arizona. Police set up roadblocks near Casa Grande as tips and sightings poured in. When a van approached, shots were fired, and the fugitives broke through only to hit another roadblock a few miles later. In the confrontation that followed, Donald Tison was killed. Ricky and Raymond Tison and Greenawalt surrendered soon after, but Gary Tison ran into the desert alone. Psychologically, the story that emerges is less about secrecy and more about force of will. A man already serving life for killing a guard, confident enough to attempt escape again, and influential enough to draw his sons into it. The courts later focused on how major participation and reckless indifference shaped responsibility across the group, even when different members played different roles. Gary Tison was found dead in the Arizona desert in late August of 1978, with authorities attributing his death to exposure and dehydration. Number 5. Matthew. John Murray was 24 years old when his name became tied to a single day of violence that moved from Arvada to Colorado Springs. He lived in Englewood, just south of Denver, and was often described as a computer-focused young man, rather than someone with a clear career path. People who knew the family spoke of a strict, deeply religious home life, with Murray largely homeschooled and somewhat isolated socially. From the outside, he could seem quiet and ordinary, the kind of person who might pass through life without drawing attention. Years earlier, Murray had tried to connect with the same faith world he would later target. He enrolled in a Youth with a Mission training program in Arvada, looking for purpose and community. Leaders later said he was dismissed because health-related issues made it unsafe for him to continue and travel with the group. Over time, investigators said he grew bitter about that rejection. In the weeks before the shootings, police and reporters linked him to hostile letters and online posts aimed at evangelical Christians. Reporting based on police summaries also suggested instability that friends could not always name, but could sometimes sense. His parents told investigators he showed signs consistent with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder when he was young. As a teenager, he sometimes described himself as bipolar and talked about hearing voices. Investigators later said his computer activity reflected a growing obsession with weapons and past mass shootings, as if he was studying other tragedies and imagining his own attack. Just after midnight on December 9, 2007, Murray arrived at the Youth with a Mission training center in Arvada after a holiday banquet had ended. He asked staff members if he could stay the night. When they refused, he opened fire inside the building. 2 staff members were killed. Tiffany Johnson, 26 years old, and Philip Kraus, 24 years old, and 2 others were wounded. Survivors later described a sudden shift from an ordinary night to confusion and fear, with people locking doors, calling 911, and guiding others away from the hallway. What makes this case especially tense is the long stretch between the scenes. Investigators believed Murray returned toward home, used his computer, and continued posting online during the hours after the first attack. A timeline summarized in local reporting said his mother saw him that morning and believed he seemed in good spirits, a detail that felt haunting once the day's events were understood. Federal investigators later reported that he traveled about 7 miles before reaching Colorado Springs. Early that afternoon, as services ended at New Life Church, families were moving through parking lots and corridors when Murray opened fire again. 2 teenage sisters were killed, Stephanie Works, 18 years old, and Rachel Works, 16 years old, and others were wounded, including their father. A volunteer security guard, Jean Assam, a former police officer, confronted Murray and shot him, and authorities credited her actions with stopping the attack from spreading deeper into the building. There was no trial and no sentencing phase. Authorities concluded that Matthew John Murray died by suicide later that same day on December 9, 2007. Number 6. Robert Merlin Spangler was 67 years old when investigators arrested him in the year 2000. By then, he had spent decades blending into Colorado life, as an educated, well-spoken man who could seem steady and approachable. Neighbors remembered a good neighbor type who refereed youth soccer and performed in dinner theater. Spangler was raised in Iowa and later settled in Littleton, Colorado. He married his high school sweetheart Nancy, and they had 2 children, David and Susan. Behind closed doors, the marriage was troubled. Investigators later documented conflict and an affair, and Spangler admitted he planned to leave. When detectives finally got him talking years later, he described his thinking with cold practicality, telling them he believed killing his family was easier than going through divorce. On the morning of December 30th, 1978, Nancy Spangler, 45 years old, and their children David, 17, and Susan, 15, were found dead inside the family home. Each had been shot with a .38 caliber handgun. A typewritten note was left behind, shaped to suggest Nancy had killed the children and then herself. Investigators questioned Spangler, and his account shifted, but the staging dominated the official conclusion. The case was closed as a murder-suicide, and much of the remaining evidence was later returned to him or destroyed. What lingered for the people who loved Nancy, David, and Susan was the feeling that something about the story never sat right, even as the file went quiet. Years passed, and Spangler's life reset through new relationships. In August of 1990, he married Donna Sundling, a 58-year-old aerobics instructor with grown children and grandchildren. Friends said she feared heights, and the marriage became strained. In April of 1993, the couple traveled to Grand Canyon National Park on a backpacking trip described as an effort to repair their relationship. During a hike, Donna fell from a high section of trail. Spangler walked to a ranger station and calmly reported that she had slipped and fallen. Her death was ruled an accident, and he was not charged. Afterward, he reinforced that version publicly, giving interviews that focused on the dangers of hiking and the heartbreak of sudden loss. The case finally moved when agencies compared notes. In the late 1990s, investigators in Colorado and Arizona coordinated looking at the Littleton deaths alongside Donna's death at the Grand Canyon. Then a woman who knew Spangler provided a letter in which he wrote that he was terminally ill. With physical evidence from the earlier case largely gone, detectives knew a detailed confession might be the only path to prosecution. Investigators approached Spangler at home, and he agreed to recorded interviews at a sheriff's office. Because he was seriously ill, the team documented that he understood what he was saying and that his statements were voluntary. He admitted killing Nancy, David, and Susan, and he pleaded guilty in federal court in Arizona to first-degree murder for Donna Sundling Spangler's death. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he died of cancer while incarcerated in a federal medical facility in Springfield, Missouri, on August 5, 2001. Number 7. Scott Lee Kimball was 39 years old when he was arrested in Southern California in mid-March of 2006. By then, he had spent years drifting through Boulder County and the Denver area with no steady, honest occupation, living as a con man who forged checks, stole identities, and reinvented himself whenever a story started to fall apart. He was also a father of 2 young sons, and he could sound calm and believable. After a check fraud conviction, Kimball persuaded federal agents to let him out of prison in late December of 2002 to work as a paid informant. To the people he targeted, that sounded like proof he was important. Kimball leaned into it, using secrecy as a shield and hinting that he was working cases. In some relationships, he even claimed he was an FBI agent, and he used the nickname Hannibal as if it were a clever inside joke. The deaths tied to Kimball unfolded from early 2003 into the summer of 2004, and the victims were people pulled close enough to trust him. Leanne Emery, 24 years old from Centennial, disappeared in January of 2003 after becoming involved with him. A few weeks later, Jennifer Lynn Markham, 25 years old, vanished after she had just moved in with Kimball and was preparing to travel with him. Investigators said Markham was last believed to be headed to Denver International Airport, and her car was later found abandoned near Pena Boulevard, close to the airport. Kimball later confessed to killing her, but her remains have never been recovered. In August of 2003, Casey McLeod, 19 years old, disappeared. Casey's family searched and pleaded for help, while Kimball kept acting like life was normal. He later married Casey's mother, a detail that made the situation feel even more unreal to relatives who were desperate for answers. Years later, a hunter found Casey's remains in rural northern Colorado. Kimball's uncle Terry Kimball, 60 years old, vanished the following year. Investigators later said Kimball used a handgun in the killings. What stood out was less a single explosion of rage than a steady pattern of control isolating people, managing narratives, and cutting off anyone who threatened to expose him. The break came when Kimball fled Colorado during another fraud investigation. Authorities tracked him in Riverside County, and a pursuit ended with his surrender. Detectives compared timelines, re-interviewed witnesses, and challenged earlier assumptions that had kept the disappearances separate. As evidence mounted, prosecutors pursued a plea agreement that could deliver answers. Kimball agreed to plead guilty and guide investigators to remains, directing them to Emery's remains near Moab, Utah, and his uncle's remains near Vail Pass in Colorado. In court, relatives of the victims filled the room as the details became official. In early October of 2009, Kimball pleaded guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Number 8. James Eagan. Holmes was 24 years old on the night of July 20th, 2012, when a midnight movie in Aurora, Colorado, became a scene of terror. At the time, Holmes was a former neuroscience graduate student who had withdrawn from the University of Colorado, Denver. People who crossed paths with him often described a quiet, highly intelligent young man who seemed socially distant, more comfortable in his own head than in a room full of classmates. In the months leading up to the shooting, his world narrowed. Reporting and court testimony described increasing isolation, heavy strain, and worsening mental health. Those details later became central in court, because the case was never only about what happened, but also about how Holmes understood it. His defense argued he was severely mentally ill. Prosecutors argued that careful planning showed he knew right from wrong and chose his actions anyway. Just after midnight, Holmes entered the Century 16 movie theater during a showing of The Dark Knight Rises. He wore protective gear and carried multiple firearms. He released chemical irritants inside the auditorium and then began shooting into the crowd. The room erupted into confusion. People dropped to the floor, stumbled through dark aisles, and tried to pull others to exits while alarms sounded and voices shouted for help. By the time it ended, 12 people were dead, and 70 others were wounded. The victims were strangers to Holmes, and that distance made the loss feel even more senseless to many families. They included Jonathan Blunk, Alexander Boyk, Jesse Childress, Gordon Cowden, Jessica Cowie, John Larimer, Matt McQuinn, Michaela, Medek, Alex Sullivan, Alexander Tevis, and Rebecca Wingo. The youngest was Veronica Moser Sullivan, who was 6 years old. In the days that followed, Aurora became a place of vigils. hospital updates, and long lines outside donation centers as the community tried to respond to grief and fear with whatever help it could offer. Police arrested Holmes outside the theater within minutes. Investigators then faced a second emergency. His apartment had been rigged with explosive devices forcing evacuations and a painstaking effort to make the building safe. That discovery shaped the early headlines and underscored how far the planning had gone beyond a single location. In June of 2013, a judge accepted Holmes's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, setting in motion lengthy psychiatric evaluations. When the trial began in the spring of 2015, the courtroom heard weeks of testimony not only about the timeline, but about mental illness intent and legal responsibility. Experts disagreed over diagnoses and what they meant under Colorado's standard for insanity, while survivors and families described the moment their lives split into before and after. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense and found Holmes guilty on all charges, including 12 counts of first-degree murder and many counts of attempted murder. Because the jurors did not reach a unanimous decision for a death sentence, the court imposed the maximum alternative punishment. In late August of 2015, Holmes was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 3,318 years. He was later transferred out of Colorado and is incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary Allenwood, a maximum security federal prison in Pennsylvania. Number 9. Kelli Lynn Murphy was 41 years old when Castle Rock, Colorado police arrested her on a Monday morning in late May of 2011. She was known publicly as a mother of two, Liam, 9 years old, and Madigan, 6 years old. The family lived in the Founders Village area of Douglas County, a suburban community south of Denver, where school routines and neighborhood life can make a family seem easy to understand from the outside. In the months before the deaths, Murphy's private life was marked by escalating conflict and instability. Court records and early reporting showed the couple filed for bankruptcy and then for divorce. A temporary restraining order connected to domestic conflict was granted and later vacated, and Murphy attempted to withdraw the divorce request, writing that she had filed wrongly out of anger. Police also said officers responded to 5 or 6 calls at the home in recent months, but that no criminal behavior was suspected during those earlier visits. As the legal process moved forward, the dispute over custody became a central pressure point. Prosecutors later argued that Murphy was adamant about keeping custody on her own terms and that she saw the prospect of sharing parenting time as unacceptable. In their telling, the approaching court dates and negotiations didn't calm the situation, they sharpened it, turning a family breakup into a crisis she felt she could not control. On the morning of May 23rd, Murphy called 911 and told the dispatcher she intended to take her own life. During that call, she said her children were in heaven. Officers went to the home and found Liam and Madigan in their beds. Early reports noted no visible injuries, and investigators waited for additional testing before publicly confirming how the children died. Murphy was taken for medical treatment and then placed into police custody the same day. As the investigation progressed, the coroner's conclusion made the tragedy harder to deny and easier to define. The children had been killed, and the cause was smothering. From there, the case focused tightly on Murphy's actions and state of mind. Prosecutors said the killings were driven by revenge against her husband during the divorce, and custody dispute, an act meant to deny him a future relationship with the children and to prevent a custody outcome she refused to accept. At trial, the defense did not point to another suspect. Instead, Murphy's attorney argued that she was depressed and intoxicated, claiming she blacked out after drinking vodka and taking pills, and that she did not remember what happened. Prosecutors rejected that explanation, urging jurors to see deliberation rather than confusion, and to weigh the 911 call and the surrounding circumstances as evidence of intent. On Tuesday, November 27, 2012, a Douglas County jury convicted Murphy of multiple counts of first-degree murder, including counts tied to the children being under 12 and her position of trust. The verdict came on what would have been Liam's 11th birthday, and the judge immediately imposed 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, ordered to be served consecutively. Number 10. Eric David Harris was 18 years old when he helped carry out the Columbine High School attack in Columbine near Littleton, Colorado. He was a senior at Columbine and worked part-time at a local pizza shop, a routine that helped him maintain a public image that did not always match what he was becoming privately. Harris was born in Wichita, Kansas, and his childhood was shaped by frequent moves because his father served as an Air Force pilot. When the family settled in Colorado in the early 1990s, Harris had to restart socially, and later accounts describe him as outwardly functional while growing more resentful beneath the surface. In the year before the attack, warning signs and stressors began stacking up. Harris and Dylan Klebold were arrested after breaking into a van and stealing items, then entered a juvenile diversion program that included counseling and community service. A later state review documented multiple third-party contacts to the sheriff's office about Harris, including complaints tied to threatening material posted online. Those reports created a trail of concern, but they did not translate into an intervention that stopped what was coming. Privately, Harris's writing and online behavior suggest an escalating inner life built around contempt, grievance, and a need to feel powerful. He used the nickname Reb, and investigators later recovered journals and recorded videos that reflected long-term planning and a fixation on making a national impact. The tension that still unsettles people is how easily he could switch masks outwardly ordinary in everyday life, then intensely hostile in the private world he documented. On April 20, 1999, Harris and Klebold arrived at Columbine High School carrying firearms and homemade explosives. Investigators later concluded the plan was not limited to gunfire. Devices placed in the school cafeteria were intended to detonate and cause mass casualties, but they failed to explode. After that, the attack moved quickly through parts of the campus. In less than 20 minutes, 12 students and 1 teacher were killed. Rachel Scott, Daniel Rohrbaugh, William, David Sanders, Kyle Velasquez, Stephen Curnow, Cassie Bernal, Isaiah Schules, Matthew Kechter, Lauren Townsend, John Tomlin, Kelly Fleming, Daniel Mauser, and Corey DePuter. Most victims had no personal connection to Harris, beyond being classmates and staff in the same building. As the immediate danger ended, the investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI assisted local authorities by pursuing internet leads, conducting witness interviews, and helping process evidence. Jefferson County investigators assembled an extensive case file, and a final investigative report was released in the spring of 2000. Public attention focused not only on what happened inside the school, but also on the earlier signals that existed in records and reports, and on the material Harris left behind. Because Harris died at the scene, there was no trial. Most understanding of his motivation comes from the evidence he created himself, writings and recordings that pointed to grievance, grandiosity, and an intent to maximize harm rather than settle a single personal score. Eric Harris died at Columbine High School on April 20, 1999.